Good afternoon, everyone. I'm quickly going to change our view to be speaker view. We're currently in gallery view. So now, folks, you should just be seeing me as I'm the one speaking here today. But good afternoon. My name is Alexis Alvarez, and I'm the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. I'm so happy to be here with you today for part 2 of our exciting installment, our training series on trauma-informed representation. For those of you who are joining us for the first time in this series today, welcome. For those of you who are coming back after part 1, thank you for coming back. So to give a little bit of background, in part 1, we really focused on trauma-informed representation, what, how, why, really understanding those definitions, those terms, and sort of what we're going to be talking about. In this part 2, we're going to elaborate. We're going to elaborate, provide more resources, and also talk about how, as the title says, you can achieve these things in more than just a spa day. So some housekeeping announcements before I go into introducing our speaker and turning it over to our speaker. This is recorded. A copy of the recording will be sent to all of you who are here, all of you who registered, and that recording will come in the form of an email from Zoom within 24 hours after this event. Additionally, closed captions are enabled. You should be able to press more and show captions if you need that extra accessibility. If you're having some trouble or it's not working out, please feel free to message me and I'll help you once I get off of the airtime. Third piece of housekeeping announcements, CLE credits. So part 1 of this series had some CLE credits awarded, and part 2 does as well. I will be announcing that CLE code at the end of the training. I will also put it in the chat for you all, and that CLE code will be included in that email that comes from Zoom within 24 hours. So you'll get the recording, you get the CLE, and of course, any resources if our speakers do have any for you today. And I think the final piece of housekeeping announcements is questions and answers. This is a really important topic. It's a topic that all of us as legal service warriors and people in the public sector really have a commonality in. So please don't be shy. I know it's really tough in the virtual world. Give us your questions. Put them in the Q&A, ideally. That way we can filter them better. But of course, if any of your questions come into the chat, I will do everything I can to extract that question and make sure it is presented to our speaker. So moving into who we have here today, we have an incredibly qualified and amazing lawyer and person speaking with us today about this important topic, Samantha Howell, who is the Pro Bono Director at Three Rivers Legal Services. I'm really honored to collaborate with Samantha on this. I'm really, really excited to learn from her. Any of you who have done any trainings with Samantha, just has a great way of teaching us about these things that may be tough to talk about. So I also want to acknowledge that we have Emily Calvin, who is on, but she's hanging back, not on video. For those of you who were there with us in part 1, Emily was our speaker for that part, and she's here to help monitor any questions or just be present for our discussion at the end if that is what we have time to do. And so with that being said, I am going to pop off. I'm going to put part 1, a link to part 1 of this training series into the chat. I'm going to put my email address into the chat and a reminder about Q&As into the chat. And I'm going to turn it over to Samantha, who is going to teach us about trauma-informed representation today. Samantha, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now. As Alexis noted, my name is Samantha Howell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Pro Bono Director at Three Rivers Legal Services. I've been doing this work for over a decade, and primarily in the capacity of a Pro Bono Director, Program Director. I, of course, am at Three Rivers, which is an LSC-funded organization now, but previous to this, worked at a social work organization, worked at an impact litigation firm that did civil rights work, and worked at a prisoners' rights firm. So I've had some different interactions with trauma and dealing with trauma over the course of my career. And it started actually in what I call my first big girl job, which after graduating from undergraduate college, which was a counselor at a domestic violence and drug and alcohol treatment facility. I was woefully underprepared for that and unqualified, but they'll hire anybody apparently. And That was really one of my first introductions, not just to trauma-informed services, because we were holistic and we did at least talk about having that lens if we weren't great about implementing it, but also what happens when you're taking it home with you, as happened so often. So I am going to, we're going to start with just a brief little roadmap. Emily did a fantastic job last week talking about trauma and trauma-informed representation. We're going to focus a little bit more on what's called trauma stewardship. I'm going to share a couple resources with you throughout the day, but most of the stuff that I'm pulling from is from a book called Trauma Stewardship. And it really is going to guide the conversation today, but I do want to do a little bit of a brief recap on some of the stuff we talked about last week if you were here, and if not, this will just be a fun fresher, not a refresher. But I'd love for folks to share some examples of trauma in work. And this can be anything you're comfortable sharing. I'll start by one of my most, and you can do it in the chat so folks can see, but when I did prisoners' rights litigation, the last couple years that I was there, we had an immigration unit, and we were representing folks who, were facing removal from the United States to what could be called their home country. And what we saw a lot of times is that if we lost our cases, our clients really faced death. A lot of them were fleeing gang violence and persecution for sexuality or for religion. And we knew those were the risks. And this is where I actually came across Trauma Stewardship, the book, which was recommended by one of my immigration colleagues. So I'd love for folks to just take a second and put some examples in the chat of some of the trauma that we experience in work every day. Yes, upsetting when the client doesn't have a legal defense, but it's sad, right? And it sucks to have to say, like, it sucks, but like SOL, right? This happens a lot with our housing clients where, they have a crappy landlord who's not fixing stuff and it's causing health issues for them or their child, and they want to move, but they don't have the money. And so then they want to rent withhold, and we have to explain to them, like, you can do that, but it may not resolve the issue, right? There's other things. Our own histories of trauma come forth, absolutely. That's a huge issue where sometimes we see ourselves in our clients, we see ourselves in our work. And sometimes it can be helpful because we learn to process our own trauma. Sometimes it can be not helpful and we have to step away from things. It can affect our lives. Victims and survivors of IPV don't have proof of the violence. So it's the old adage from Alcoholics Anonymous, trust but verify, is one that comes up a lot. Is you want to trust people, but you do have to verify what they say sometimes, and you can't. And we know that the courts don't always look kindly on that. When agencies we're representing clients in front of are really, really not trauma informed, yes, or judges. That's a thing, where judges re-traumatize, or prosecuting attorneys re-traumatize in domestic violence cases. You might even have agencies that are supposed to be trauma informed, like a DCF, for example, who engage in things that aren't great. Phone intake, who's flooding? Yes, the client who communicates by flooding. We call this trauma vomit. That's what we, Emily talked about flooding last week, and just sort of like just spewing all of this stuff that's going on, and some of it's relevant and some of it's not, and it's not always linear, it's not always related. They might be talking about 3 different partners who abused them over 50 years. And we used to call that trauma vomit. And we sort of turned it into a joke. We would go and be like, Christy, can I come trauma vomit on you for a minute? And to one, get permission and acknowledge, like, this is what I need to do to process and get through my day at work, but also trigger warning, right? I got a trauma vomit over this client who, had X, Y, or Z happen to them. So yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we incorporate trauma in our work. And again, just to kind of redo the recap just a little bit, I want to go over some of the terms that we use. Emily used last week. I'm going to use this week, just to kind of get us all on the same page. So trauma is how we respond to things that are really upsetting, right? Some people think of trauma as something that happens to you. You can have a traumatic experience. You can engage in some type of a traumatic experience or activity, but it's how we respond to things. And a lot of times what happens is it leads us to have some numbness. It can affect our abilities to feel things wholly or to process things wholly. And so, and wholly, WHOLLY, not HOLY, although that might also be an experience that you have with trauma. But it limits our abilities to do that. And what happens then is we oftentimes have a numbing sensation. We don't engage in things that bring us joy as often. We don't go out with friends. We don't pay attention to movies. They become white noise as opposed to things that we engage in. So that's part of what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. And there's a lot of different types of trauma that we're going to experience, right? So the first is secondary trauma. And this is when we hear about firsthand accounts. So this is when your client calls and floods you. Your client comes and discloses. I'm going to do a trigger warning here about sexual violence. When I first started working in a domestic violence shelter, one of my very first clients was very seriously sexually assaulted by her partner. And I remember that affecting me and like trust issues, right? Like I started like, who can you trust if you can't trust this person who's supposed to love you? How does that affect, people who you're meeting for the first time? How do you find new friends? And those are the types of secondary trauma experiences that we can have as we hear these things firsthand, but then we kind of suffer with that. And it affects our ability to engage or to proceed through our day in different ways. The other type of trauma that we might experience is burnout. This tends to be used exclusively in conjunction with employment or professional engagements. And there's three parts of this: feelings of energy depletion, increased mental distance from your job, and reduced efficacy. And I think it's important to highlight burnout because over the last, I'm going to say 10 years or so, as there has become an increasing awareness in the legal profession about mental health and mental wellness, I think sometimes conversations focus on vicarious trauma or secondary trauma and confuse it with burnout. And there are different ways of responding to those things. You'll hear people talking like burnout doesn't get fixed typically at the job, because it's oftentimes related to something chronic in the employment. So again, another example that I will share: when I worked in prisoners' rights work, I started working on a case in 2013 or 2014 where we were representing sex offenders. And it was great work. And I loved my clients. I really enjoyed working with them. And it was a impact litigation. We had co-counsel with a law firm, but I was the client contact. And so over the course of the 3-ish years that I worked on this case, I had over 600 sex offender clients who were communicating with me, and they were asking, for updates. And this is a case that is up for appeal now in the upcoming session in New York, in front of the appellate division. So it's been going on for a decade, right? So, when our clients are calling or writing every month, like, what's happening? You're constantly having to talk to them about it. It's exhausting. It's just exhausting. On top of that, because I was the primary client contact, litigators will especially appreciate this, and anybody who works with victims or survivors, is that when you're making an argument in front of a court, you want your client to look good. You want a good set of facts. You want somebody who's sympathetic. You want somebody who presents well. When you're picking from a group of people who are I'm going to go so far as to say universally disliked, if not outright hated. Coming up with a compelling plaintiff is a challenge. And so I was getting all of their details, all of their crime details, so that we could find the least offensive plaintiff that we could name. And one of the things that I noticed was I couldn't watch movies with sexual violence. I had to quit watching Law and Order SVU. Those types of things were triggers because I dealt with it every day, all day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6, sometimes 7, with hundreds of clients. And again, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed every bit of it, but it was exhausting. And you had to compartmentalize because you can't forget the fact that you're working with someone who is in prison for a violent offense. And, you know, for better or worse, our clients were not getting released. That's why we were bringing the lawsuit, is because they weren't being released when they should have been. But I had one client who was released and he showed up unannounced at our office and his history was stalking. And so those are the types of things that affect, like, I couldn't do anything the rest of the day. It was so distracting. And so I think those are some of the things that we have to think about. Is burnout is different than secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. They're all related, right? I was exposed to secondary trauma from those firsthand experiences, these people telling me what they did. But the burnout came from my work combined with additional chronic stress in the workplace. And that could be poor management. It could be being short-staffed. It could be ineffective assistance. It could be any number of things, a hostile work environment, a hostile political environment that affects your daily work. These are things that are chronic. And so that's why when we talk about burnout, a lot of times, you can't fix that in your workplace. A lot of times it does require a job change, because it's not just something that can be adjusted by flexible client schedule or something like that. So I harp on that a little bit because I feel like we're getting a better understanding of it, but I do feel sometimes it's still sort of used interchangeably with secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. And I do think it's a little bit different, especially in how you respond to it. So that's all I'm going to say on that, but I did want to highlight that. Okay, so the next one is, let's see here. So vicarious trauma. Now this is a lot like secondary trauma, but it's a little bit different because it's exposure to traumatic stories of others. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a firsthand experience, that you're hearing a firsthand experience. You could have vicarious trauma, for example, by watching what's happening in the Middle East right now. It's very traumatic and it's very upsetting. One of the things that happens a lot of times with vicarious trauma, though, is that we develop a preoccupation with the horrific. Again, this is sort of one of the things that I noticed when I worked in DV was it was not so much like we were trying to one up each other, but that's really kind of what was happening, right? We would go into our case management room and somebody would trauma vomit what their client said. And then somebody else would be like, well, wait till you hear what I heard today, or this is what happened on the crisis line. And it was sort of this preoccupation with horrific stories. And I think part of that goes into coping mechanism. But it is important to realize that we can experience trauma not just by sitting down and having somebody flood us or having somebody call and threaten you or something like that. We can also experience it very distantly, right? And news is a great way for anybody who's, I'm going to say, like a Gen Xer or older. We remember the days when war wasn't on the news all the time, right? Gulf War I was the first war that was fully publicized and televised. And I remember as a child seeing the green-lit missiles sailing through the night. Like, I still remember that. My dad was in the Army, and he sent me pictures of the Texas desert to prove that he wasn't in the Middle East, because I was convinced he was in the Middle East. And that didn't go well. As a child, I didn't understand that, like, that was somehow different. So, like, but that is seared in my brain. I can picture those missiles like the day that I watched them on ABC. So those are things that we can, have as well with vicarious trauma. Another thing that Emily touched on a little bit last week was PTSD, and I'm just going to touch on this really briefly. This is a recognized psychological disorder that really leads somebody to, I would say, almost a frozen response sometimes. They cannot cope with the things around them. PTSD is very common in the domestic violence world. It's very common when you're working with military veterans. It's very common when you're working with people who've experienced child abuse or any type of abuse. But it really is a manifestation of the stresses that we've been talking about in physical and emotional symptoms. So, you know, another great symptom, my bonus mom is a military veteran, and when she was overseas in Gulf War I, her plane was shot at, and she does not respond well to cars backfiring. She does not respond well to fireworks. It causes her to shake. It causes her to drop to the ground. It causes her to have these really sometimes, I don't want to say violent because she doesn't lash out at people, but very visible physical responses, right? Her body responds to the noises because of this PTSD experience. And that's a very, again, very common thing to have. And that can be a response to any of the types of trauma that we've gone over today. The other part of this that is important to realize is that responding to trauma is normal, right? We have a trauma exposure response. These are things that we do to respond to the things that happen around us. And it can happen anywhere. It can happen in any setting. Anytime you're exposed to trauma, you're going to have an exposure response. And there are a bunch of different responses that are pretty common. I don't want to say normal, but pretty common. So the first handful are, feeling helpless and hopeless. So personal responsibility for the situation. You might not see any possibility of relief or positive change. You feel that your struggles are repetitive, right? Like, sure, I helped this person, but there's just gonna be one more to replace them tomorrow. There's always more work. There's always more clients. There's always, and those kinds of always and never words are rarely helpful when it comes to trauma responses, that kind of all or nothing thinking. But this is one of the most common trauma responses that we have. Another one is the sense you can always be doing more, right? I should have taken more cases. I should have done more on this. I should have, not gone out to dinner with my husband for date night. I should have stayed home and worked on this brief some more. I should have done more research. What happens though sometimes is we also have to shift to blaming others, right? This fell through because of X, because the judge didn't do something, or because my assistant didn't do something, or the client didn't do something. When we have this sense that we're not doing enough, we sometimes confuse our ability for honest evaluation, right? Are we smart enough? Are we dedicated enough? Are we passionate enough? Are we whatever? And so we're trying to, think about honest evaluation, but we're actually confusing that with what our abilities are. And the truth is, you can't work 24 hours a day. That's not sustainable. It's not feasible. You can't miss out every date night to do more work. Yes, the work is always going to be there, but we have to find balance because, to use a overused expression, you can't pour from an empty cup, right? And that's a really important part of this. Hypervigilance, always being on, not being able to disconnect from work. I think everybody's guilty of that at some time. I personally have what I call my safety bag of work. It's a bag of work that I take home with me every day. I very seldom work on it, but it's a blanket. I have to have it there to feel connected. I have to have it to feel like I have the option of doing it, even though I go home and I'm burnt. I can't maybe always do extra work with my safety bag of work, but I do take it. So this is all progress, right, or process. This is never about the destination. It's about the journey. So diminished creativity. It's so funny, when I typed this originally, I put diminished capacity, and I'm like, well, that's a Freudian slip. But this is the being unable to change, stuck in a rut, having a hard time adapting. When we feel stressed or scared, we tend to resort to what's normal and comfortable. So that's something that can really affect our abilities to work and to respond to what's happening. Inability to hold a whole situation, right? We might take sides or blame others when something complex or challenging comes to us. We might jump to conclusions rather than thinking through, what happened here. So we again, this all ties into fight or flight, right? So we need to have quick responses. We feel like, something traumatic is happening, and so we have to respond quickly. So we might jump to conclusions, but the converse side of that, of course, is that we're not thinking things through fully. We're not giving it our full attention. I see this a lot with, I was reading an article recently about millennials who claim to be really good at multitasking, but it has been scientifically disproven. You can't actually multitask. What your brain is doing is shifting from one thing to another constantly. Some people can do that faster, but you can't actually do two things at once. And this is one of the areas where, our ability to multitask is completely trashed when you have trauma responses. The average period of time it takes to refocus is anywhere from 7 to 23 minutes is what I've read. But with trauma responses, it could be days before you can refocus. So that's another way that this sort of affects us as we proceed. Downplaying or minimizing. It's important to remember that minimizing others is invalidating. And so, when we have this response, the way that it affects others and us, because we also minimize our own trauma and trauma response and feelings and emotions, that it's invalidating. And so again, going to that all or nothing, right? Well, this never happened to me, or this will never happen to so-and-so, or this always happens to me. Those types of things are really challenging and can be quite damaging. The other thing about minimizing is that it can affect our ability to have compassion or empathize with our clients or with ourselves. And I say this, yes, clients, but also selves. This is a big part of it, is when we minimize, we don't empathize. We set ourselves up on a pedestal in some ways, and that would, that's not how this happens. And I've seen this with, people who've experienced, maybe child neglect. Maybe they had a parent who wasn't fully present, and their response is, well, they didn't hit me, right? I wasn't abused. It was just emotional neglect or intellectual neglect or social neglect. It wasn't physical abuse. And that, it ties into this comparing and contrasting, right? Everybody's trauma is valid. You don't have to have the worst trauma in the room. There's no prize. there's no, gift card that you walk away with if you have the worst trauma. And so, it's important for us to remember that, not just with others, but when we're talking to ourselves about our own experiences, right? It's a really, I think this is one of the trauma responses I see a lot. And I've done it so many times myself. And so I'm really aware of it. I was in a car accident, and it was like, well, at least I didn't die. Right. Which is a coping mechanism, but it also downplays the fact that it's been a year and I'm still in recovery, right? I'm still physically healing. I'm still emotionally healing from this really, really traumatic experience. And it's a fine line. Some of us, in serving professions and service professions, we tend to engage in humor, dark humor, gallows humor, and it's a fine line. And, you don't always know when you're crossing it. But it is something that's important to be aware of, especially if you want to engage in something sort of long-term and holistic and healthy. Chronic exhaustion. This is the difference of like hard day work tired, like you've done a hard day's work, versus heart tired, right? There are days where you just go home and literally just go to bed. There's nothing left to be done. And fatigue expresses itself in all kinds of ways, right? So there's depression, there's headaches, there's sleepiness, there's blood pressure. There was one time when I worked in prisoners' rights work, I remember going home and I swear I just sat with my mouth agape for like 3 hours, just like staring at the TV. I have no idea what was on, but I was just broken. I was just physically and emotionally and heart tired. And it's important to take care of yourself. I was joking with somebody this weekend. I was getting a massage for my leg that was injured in the accident last year. And I said, I'm not sure if it's turning 40 or having a near-death experience where I just have like 0 Fs. If I want to take a nap on a Saturday, I take a nap on a Saturday. I don't care if I need to do laundry. I don't care if there was groceries to do. If my body says you're tired, I pay attention to my body now. And I didn't do that. I didn't do that in my 20s, and I didn't do that in my 30s. And I worked a lot of late nights or overnights. And I took on a lot of stuff that I didn't have to. both tasks and trauma that I didn't have to. And I'm trying to be more conscientious about that. And I think that that's part of this trauma stewardship that I've been working on over the last decade. Inability to listen or deliberate. This can be anything from just, not going out with others, you stop answering phones, you stop doing things that bring you joy, you hope you don't have to go to your job. Thoughts like, I wish I was just in a car accident. I wish, I wish I was sick so I have to go to work. So that deliberate avoidance is a real trigger. And that's also a real trigger for burnout specifically. So that's something to be aware of. Dissociative moments. When I was working on this, I was like, wow, that's like really serious. And then I was looking at the descriptions. I'm like, oh my gosh, this has happened so many times. So this, not remembering your drive home, completely checking out, not hearing what someone is saying after minutes of being in a conversation with them. I have frequently missed my home when I've been driving. Like I'll just drive right past my house. One time I ended up almost in the next town over because I was thinking about work. We don't think of it as dissociative, perhaps, but that's one of these trauma responses. And that goes back to the prior slide where it was like not able to check out of work, not able to leave it at home. It consumes all of your thoughts. A sense of persecution. Mistreatment can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If we think that somebody's picking on us at work or singling us out, we're going to look for things that reinforce that. And we might actually engage in behaviors that result in that reinforcement. This is, sometimes we engage in gossip. That's a hard one to get out of. I mean, as a child, gossip was like what everybody did. It was very popular on TV. It was very popular in the movies. And it was just part of being like a small child, I guess. And so growing up to be an adult, professional adult, and learning how to not gossip at work, not engage in gossip, not promote gossip, not tolerate it, is really important and really hard. But it does feed this sense of persecution. It also can mean that we sometimes choose to remain powerless. We won't take actions. I should say we won't take actions that help us build our trauma response into something that's healthy or is productive, at least. And then the last group here, guilt, feeling badly when you're doing well. And this guilt can present in so many ways. Guilt is also a very common presentation of depression. So it's really important to pay attention to when you're feeling these, especially on this slide, I think guilt, fear, anger, numbings, addictions, and grandiosity. A lot of these can interplay with bipolar, they can interplay with depression, they can interplay with anxiety disorders. And so, this isn't to say that your trauma response is a mental health crisis. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that sometimes there's overlay. And sometimes we have anxiety and our trauma response aggravates that anxiety or aggravates that depression because of how it presents. So guilt, I think, is a pretty common one. And this can be guilt over, I'm doing well and they're not doing well. My client isn't doing well. Like I didn't suffer from COVID, but my client has COVID. It can be, I got a promotion, but this other person did it and I feel bad. It could be, I didn't do enough, right? Going back to that first slide, I didn't do enough. Any number of things can result in guilt when we're exposed to trauma. Intense feelings of personal vulnerability or potential victimization, over responding to situations. So fear is a real common one. And the thing here is much like anger, which we're going to talk about in a second. Fear can be healthy, right? Fear is something that has allowed us to evolve to avoid snakes and bears and spiders. And there are healthy fears, but then there are fears that limit our experiences. And the second one is the one we've got to look out for. And so, again, I had this car accident. I was hit by a car, and there were days where I did not want to go back out and drive. There were days where I didn't want to walk on a sidewalk because of the fear. And for me, exposure therapy was helpful in the situation. So I kept driving. Now, I don't ride a bike anymore. I was on my bike when I was hit by a car. Haven't ridden a bike yet, and it's been a year. But I have been able to drive. And so I think, again, realizing what is a healthy fear versus a fear that limits our experiences, and acknowledging, is this something that I'm okay with, or is this something that's impairing my ability to function and engage with the life that I want? Do I miss riding a bike? Sure, but I'm still not there yet. So I think, again, kind of processing these things is really important. And I think I said this once, but if I didn't, I'll say it again and again. These are journeys. These are not destinations. They're not contests. Your responses to trauma is not linear necessarily. It doesn't stay. It's not just guilt. It's not just dissociation. You could have all 16 of these or one of them. And so, going back and forth is okay. And that's an important part of self-care, is understanding how we respond to trauma, which may or may not be the same for each person in the Zoom room today. But understanding that, there are some pretty common responses. How are we going to respond to them? And then, just like we would with a client, helping them come up with a safety plan, like, what's our self-care plan, right? If I'm feeling guilt, or if I'm feeling anger, if I'm using those all or nothing phrases, what is it that I can do to get back on a healthy, productive track? And sometimes you have to sit in it, especially with anger. Anger is very healthy, and it's helpful to sit in it sometimes for a hot minute. But then you kind of have to move forward. So anger, like I said, it's very healthy. But where you want to pay attention is when you can't process your anger without being like passive aggressive or pretentious, or needing to apologize for being like rude and mean. Being, you're straight, what you might think is straightforward, but what actually just comes off as passive aggressive or rude or mean. And I like this definition. Cynicism is anger with sarcasm. And as somebody who comes from a sarcastic family, yes, I think that describes so many interactions. So having anger and cynicism. And again, I think it's important, especially with anger, is there are times where it's very important to sit with that. But again, how we use it is what the key is here. So engaging, feeling our anger without punishing other people because of our anger, is a important challenge or skill. Numbing and inability to empathize. Sometimes our emotions just shut down when we're overwhelmed. We become a saturated sponge. And this can lead us to that trauma vomit or flooding that Emily was talking about, where it just leaks out everywhere. So it's kind of two sides of one coin. Sometimes we numb and we don't engage. Sometimes we saturate and we sort of trauma vomit. And sometimes the numbing affects us, like I said, in our ability to empathize. We just can't do it anymore. And that can be, we can't work with these types of clients. I can't have a relationship with this person. I can't do X, I can't do Y. It can lead into a lot of different ways. Addictions. And so I'm not going to say a whole lot about addictions, but I do want to flag a couple of little things here. So one, there's a really fabulous book called Smashed. And it was written by the wife of an attorney who was an addict for a large international law firm, and died, I want to say, in 2014. And he had been on a conference call potentially while he was using, and he died alone in his house. And I think it was several days before he was found. And she wrote an article to the New York Times about the pressures of large firm life, big firm life, and sort of the underbelly that led to substance abuse and poor mental health care amongst the partners. And she did a follow-up piece after his funeral, because she went to the funeral and like people from his firm came, but they were on their phones working the whole time. And so she did this follow-up piece about the addiction to work and, again, its effect on mental health. I highly recommend her 2 New York Times articles. I can't remember her name. I do apologize. The book is called Smashed. Really easy read, heartbreaking. But it was around that time that I started getting a sense from like the American Bar Association and my local state bar association that people were starting to pay attention to mental health in the legal profession again, or for the first time, perhaps. And that's been a really interesting change over the last decade that I've seen is a much greater attention. It does seem to be a lot around addiction, to some degree mental health, but like these sort of nuanced conversations about like trauma-informed care, it's a lot of focus towards our clients, but not a lot of focus from an organizational perspective. And I think that's, the next phase that we have to focus on is looking at organizationally, are we trauma informed and engaging in a way that promotes trauma stewardship and processing of the things that we're working with to create sustainable work environments. The last trauma response that's really common is grandiosity. And I will joke, I think everyone is guilty of this at some point, because if I want to take time off, but like there's all this stuff to do, right? That's the thing. I want, and people will have hundreds of hours of leave saved up, because if I take time off, my clients will suffer. If I take time off, I'm going to be a burden to my staff. Those are feelings of grandiosity that come from our trauma responses, that come from our work. And that's one of the most common things that I see, and how it presents itself is we lose sight of our capacities and our limits. And work is the center of our identity. Now, somebody who will say work is the center of my identity. Alexis was like, what is your bio? I was like, I'm a pro bono director. That's all you need to say, because that's all I am. There's good things and bad things, right? Grandiosity, if you take it a step back, can be self-confidence, right? But when it affects that, when we lose sight of what our capacities and our limits are, then we think we're too great or not enough. And there's, two sides of the same coin. But it does do, again, the most common sort of manifestation of this that I see is people not taking time off, not taking the time to care for themselves. And I've been in public interest my entire career, and I always tell people we don't make enough money in public interest to not take advantage of the benefits. And one of the benefits is time off. And it takes months of planning sometimes, and it takes a village. You might have to go to your managing attorney and say, I want to take 2 weeks off on these dates, and it's 3 months out, and I need your help to make that happen, right? And we don't always know 3 months or 6 months out that we need 2 weeks off for our mental health. But this is part of why we have to monitor and stay engaged actively over the course of our careers and our jobs, to make sure that we are paying attention to our needs and taking advantage of those benefits, right? That's what we get them for. All right, there's one more trauma response that's pretty common, and that's compassion satisfaction. So I'm ending our trauma response conversation with a good note. So the compassion satisfaction is the pleasure you get from doing your work, right? You feel effective, like you've contributed, you feel successful, you feel hopeful. When you feel compassion satisfaction, it actually activates the reward center of our brain. So it releases the chemicals that make us happy and make us want to do more. The flip side of that is, if we don't have that, then we can get bogged down from those trauma responses, because we lost a case, or our client suffered, or we had a vacation planned, and while we really wanted to be with them at their hearing, we couldn't do it. So again, it's about nurturing a garden, right? It's a constant tending to every minute of every day. You really have to pay attention to where you are, so that you can navigate through these things in a healthy way that's productive, and helpful for you. Okay, so I'm going to go into a conversation now about trauma stewardship. As I mentioned, this is largely from a book called Trauma Stewardship by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky and Connie Burke. A lot of those 16 trauma responses, those are all discussed in there. And trauma stewardship is really about finding ways to acknowledge that your stress is genuine, your trauma is genuine, and you're looking for healthy ways to deal with them, right? There's this great quote in the book that I love. The author says, "There's historically a widely held belief that if you're tough enough and cool enough and committed to your cause enough, you'll keep on keeping on, you'll suck it up." And I think a lot of us have that mentality, right? We're gonna do it. Somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to do it. I love my work. Somebody's got to do it. Yes, that is all fair, but sometimes somebody has to be someone else. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong to say, I cannot do this today, or I cannot take these cases anymore. I can't do sex assault work anymore. I can't work with sex offenders anymore. I can't work on child abuse cases, or even I need a break. Can I move from family to probate? Can I learn a new area of law? Can I work on a grant that requires more outreach so that I'm getting out of the office a little bit more and I can reduce my caseload? There are ways that we can respond within our work environment to help us help us navigate these stresses in healthy ways. So trauma stewardship is really about learning that we have choices about where we put our focus. It's not just about putting on a happy face. And that's why I said, like, this is more than just a spa day. And spa days are great, and they may be how you need to navigate your trauma. That's fine. But it's also about being more present and intentional and active day to day, right? Trauma stewardship is about forming a daily practice to tend to our trauma and pain and hardships and stressors, requiring a sense of awareness of others' needs as well, right? Because we're in the service profession, we are in a serving field. So we don't want to forget that there are other people, but we also have to be in a place where we can take care of ourselves. And it doesn't have to, this doesn't have to be, you were hit by a car. Like, this doesn't have to be these massive traumas. Remember, trauma is not competition. Trauma can be, I whacked my knee on the desk today and it really hurt. And I need 10 minutes to ice my knee and feel the pain and cry and deal with that. And then I can get back to what I'm doing, right? It could be somebody walks into your office and they are ugly crying and snot's coming out of their nose, and they're having a horrible thing, and you need to take 5 minutes. You take a walk around the building. It could be that you put it off to the end of the day and then you do take your spa day. You go home and light your candles and have your scents in your bathtub and you relax. I took a 3.5-hour bath last weekend. Like, I am all for that. There is absolutely a place for those types of indulgences. But the idea of trauma stewardship is that we're doing little things like that every day so that it doesn't pile up to where we're having burnout, to where we're having shutdowns, to where we cannot function. Just like, if you're on a self-esteem practice, or a self-esteem journey or self-acceptance journey, a lot of what folks talk about is, starting each day with something about it, intentional work, or this is my goal for today. I'm good enough, right? I am going to do my best. I'm going to do everything that I feel like I can in this moment, right? It's these little sort of mantras that we find that help us guide us through the day so that we can engage in what we're doing. And over time, what it does is it helps build armor so that we can respond to trauma more healthily as an automatic response that, becomes sort of a learned behavior or an unconscious behavior that you're just engaging in because you're like, okay, trauma, here's what I'm going to do. So it starts building up an immune system. That's what I'm looking for. Our immune system to trauma builds up when we engage in these daily practices. But to start, we have to know what our baseline is. We've got to know what we feel and what we value and experience and what we need to do to take care of ourselves. And that's why, again, with the spa day, for some folks that works. For some, it does not. Some people are not 3-hour bath people. One of the most traumatic events that I ever dealt with in my life, I dealt with by going to a used bookstore, and I was there for 4 hours because that is my comfort. Some people go to church, some people mow their lawn, whatever it is. There's no right or wrong answer, so long as it's moving you towards a healthy maintenance of your stress and your trauma and your hardships. The other part of trauma stewardship that's really important is engaging the things that we're experiencing, like our trauma and oppressions from our clients or our work or our family members, while not internalizing them. Part of trauma stewardship is learning that we don't have to take everything on as our own. And that's hard because we're doing the work we're doing because we're helpers, we're problem solvers. We like to resolve things. We like to wrap it up and slap a bow on it and spank it on the bottom and be like, we're done. We've done this. But we can't always do that when we take things home with us. And that's been one of the hardest experiences that I had in my life. And that's, at the top of this, I mentioned my first big girl job working at a domestic violence shelter, and this client who just had a horrible go of it, just had a horrible experience. And I still remember her telling me about it. I can still feel that moment when she disclosed her trauma to me. I've internalized that to some degree, right? I have carried that with me. We had a client who, came several times over and over and over again, and was not able to hear the things that we were saying and providing. She was not able to use them, and it ended fatally for her. And those were really hard moments for us, because everybody there felt like they failed. And so, at the end of the day, you're not there to solve every crisis of your client. You are not there to make their decisions for them. I had a colleague who used to say one of the great things about our world is that everyone has the right to F up their own lives. And that actually helps a lot. To think about. People have the right and the freedom to make bad decisions. And so that it perhaps, again, a little callous, perhaps a little gallowy, but was a good reminder. And I carry that with me as a good reminder that I cannot fix other people's problems. I can lay out the tools on a table for them, but at the end of the day, they have to pick them up and they have to do the hammer and the nail themselves. And that, I think, is a really, if you can get to that point, I think that's a real big turning point in carrying trauma with you, be that, again, personal or work trauma. Okay, so there's 3 different types of trauma or levels of trauma stewardship. Personal dynamics is who we are, our histories, what brought us to today, our work, our strengths, things like that. So learning about, learning what our family does, like, so I respond to trauma as an A to B person. I'm a take charge person. So like when my grandmother died, I'm like, okay, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to. And meanwhile, my family is like processing and telling stories, and they're crying. And I'm like, do we have a casket? Right? Like I am, it can come across a little callous, but that's how I process. And I notice that sometimes, like, one of my family members spirals. So when she has trauma, she gets on a thought and she just spirals. It's like a tornado with 3 items stuck in it, and that's all she can focus on. And so learning how we work is helpful in figuring out what's going to work for us in moving forward and how we can do it effectively. There's organizational tendencies, what's available at our job. What are the views on our jobs? Why do we do what we do? Is it important? Those can impact the type of trauma stewardship support that we have. And then the last one is societal forces, how the world views what we do, how it labels the work that we do. When you tell people what you do, what do they say? Do they say like, wow, that's really inspiring? Or like, oh my gosh, that must be so hard, right? And what's your response? Like, yeah, it is hard, but this is that. They're like, yeah, I had the worst day today. So thinking about these different levels of trauma stewardship, there's different ways we can engage in the stuff that we're going to get ready to talk about, and in managing those 16 trauma responses that we just went over. So one of the things I mentioned a few minutes ago is establishing a baseline. And this is just one example. You don't have to use this, but it's the ProQual, it's the professional quality of life measure. They ask you 30 questions about satisfaction and stress. And in the result, they tell you your risk of compassion, satisfaction, burnout, and secondary trauma stress. I went through this and was very happy with my results because I'm in a good place when I took the test, I guess. But like examples of the things that they're going to say to you is like, I am happy, right? On a 1 to 5, with 5 being very often, 1 being rarely often, I am happy. I find it difficult to separate my personal life from my life as a helper. My work makes me feel satisfied. I feel bogged down by the system. I feel worn out because of my work as a helper. So this is one of those things where it's great. It's free. Just log on, take it. I do it every once in a while, every couple of years. I just log on. I'm like, how am I doing today? How's my burnout? And it's a baseline. So this is just kind of a great way to kind of establish that very, very basic approach. Okay, more than just a spa day. So self-care is a way to increase that compassion satisfaction that I was talking about earlier. This involves creating a sense of personal control, the ability to pursue personally meaningful tasks, healthy lifestyle choices, social support, and patience. And there's a lot of different components of self-care. But this becomes a personal journey. You got to define what constitutes self-care for you, right? Spa day for some, bookstore for others. Your attitudes, I think sometimes people are like, oh, it's a little foo-foo. Sure, it's foo-foo if you make it foo-foo. Maybe that's not your thing. Maybe your self-care is building a bookcase. I wouldn't call that foo-foo, but getting your hands dirty is good. So it's important to come up with what works for you. And I want to take just a minute. I know we're approaching the hour mark, so there might be folks who have to jump off because it's the end of your lunch break. If so, thank you for spending lunch with me. But I do want to take just a couple minutes for folks to put in some ideas of what you do to take care of yourselves. So just throw them in the chat. There's no wrong answers. I garden. I love weeding. It is so aggressive. And when you're having an angry day, to go and just rip weeds out, it's so cathartic. That's one of my favorite things to do to take care of myself. Bookstores, compulsive book buying, probably borderline addiction at this point because I have more books than I could possibly read. Fishing, yard work, daily walking, working out, greeting card browsing and buying. Oh, I love that. I have an entire box because I buy greeting cards when something jumps out at me. So I have like my aunt's next 5 birthday cards because she's so easy to buy for. A 1,000-piece puzzle, reading mystery novels, being near water. Yes, listening to water, getting involved with your church, hammock hanging. So hanging hammocks or being in a hammock? Is just hang hammocks for a living in a hammock. So there's all these different ways that we can take care of ourselves. And one thing that I love that came up in preparing for this is this dimensions of self-care diagram, which is reminiscent of the power and control wheel, but reminds us that there's different dimensions of self-care, right? There's emotional self-care, there's physical self-care. And many of us who work in helping professions are so used to operating at a sprint that coming to the moment, taking this time feels indulgent. It feels grandiose. It feels all of these things. But there's all these different dimensions, and in order to engage in good trauma stewardship, we have to pay attention to each of these dimensions. We can't just do one, because eventually, just like the power and control wheel, it's gonna shift. There's going to be a shift from emotional abuse to physical abuse or verbal abuse or financial abuse, right? These things can grow. They're not linear, but they can shift. And so we have to make sure that we're paying attention to all of these things. And some examples, physical, right? Sleeping, eating healthy, getting medical care that you need, exercise, reading to groups of preschoolers. Oh my gosh, performative interactive reading. I love that. You doing the voices and the animations with your hands, taking breaks. We here at Three Rivers, we started last year. A couple of us were like, we're going to go for a walk every day at lunch. It takes 7 minutes to walk around our building. So you can do that and still have a full lunch hour, just 7 minutes. But you get to know your colleagues. It didn't last long because it got too hot and humid, but it was a good idea. Maybe we'll start it back up. Psychological self-care, right? This process is self-care in the psychological sense because it engages self-reflection, but saying no is an important part here. I was reading a book, and I apologize for folks who don't know me because almost everything I say is prefaced by I was reading a book. But I was reading a book, and what it suggested was that your answers to will you do X should only ever be no or let me think about it. Because if you say yes, you have to trade off. So don't say yes until you've thought about it and you've identified what the trade-off is. And while I am not perfect in my implementation of that rule, I use it every day. And I have to stop myself. I'll even say like, yeah, oh, wait, let me think about it because I have this other thing. Like sometimes I have to walk myself back, but saying no is really a big one. And at least being conscious of the fact that if you say yes, there is a trade-off. You are saying this thing that you've asked me is more important than something else that I have already chosen to do. And then I'm going to give that up. And so that's been like a life-changing thing for me. And again, I'm not perfect at it, but it is a journey. Self-affirmations, finding ways to laugh. One of my favorite things to do if I'm having a bad day is go home and watch Psych. It's just, I can almost bring myself to tears watching that show sometimes. Meditation, reading, all of these things are dimensions of self-care that can help us navigate all of the things that we've been talking about. One of the other cool tools in trauma stewardship that they talk about is the 5 directions. And each of these relate to an element, and I didn't write them down. I apologize. One of them is water, wind, fire, and earth. I just don't remember. But north is about creating a space for inquiry. So why am I doing what I'm doing? And some of the suggestions that they have for this is brainstorm 5 ways in which you think what you're doing is working for you. Take a few breaths, review your list, and then look at how those are or are not in the best interest of those you serve, right? So, for example, I say yes a lot more than I should. That is because I want to help, right? I'm doing what I'm doing because I want to help. One of the ways that I think what I'm doing is working is that I do a lot. I spread myself thin. But when I reflect on it, I realize I spread myself too thin and I can't always do things that I want to the fullest of my capacity. So I might be kind of 50%ing it here, 80%ing it there. And then maybe I can hit a 90% somewhere, but more likely I'm going to hit another 60% somewhere, right? Because I'm being drawn in so many different directions. So that's just one of the little tasks that they have. And I really like these little activities that they have. East is about choosing our focus. So here they suggest brainstorm 3 things that make a specific work situation challenging. Write down 3 things that make it enjoyable and ask, what do I focus on and why? Right? So like some of the things that we talked about earlier with trauma, one of the things that makes a specific work situation challenging is angry clients who call us and complain. Something that makes it enjoyable, helping people who are really struggling. And then what are we focusing on? Are we focusing on the helping part or on the angry part? And there's not always perfect analog, so don't worry if you're not feeling that one. But I do think a lot of times we can look at specific work situations and realize we do tend to focus on the negative as opposed to the positive. But when you sit and force yourself to identify the things that were enjoyable, it can help you sort of realign your focus. Ask yourself what you would be doing if you're not doing your current work. And then what are 5 things you can do to achieve your plan B? So I always joke that, my retirement goal is to get paid somehow after I leave the legal profession, to get paid to read and drink coffee and pet cats. That's what I want to do with my free time. Ideally near some water, because I do love the sound of that. So what is it that I can do to achieve that plan, right? Well, how would I do that? I've thought about opening a bookstore. I've thought about moving to a place near water. I have thought about starting my own business. So you might think about what's going to get me there and what can I do to take a step in that direction. I bought a house recently and actually built a library. So now I have a place where I can go and sit and read and drink coffee in my house. I have an actual library in my house. It's lovely. It has been my childhood goal. Some people want to become superheroes. I apparently wanted to be a librarian. So, something for everybody there. South is about building compassion and community. So what have those who raised you done to heal themselves? What has worked for them or not worked for them? Talking earlier about my family, I have family that spirals when they're trying to deal with trauma. That does not work. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for them. And I've been able to associate that. I have a family member who gets really mean when she's dealing with trauma. She lashes out. That doesn't work for me. But then I have somebody else who has engaged in a life of her own form of trauma stewardship and is very compassionate. When she deals with trauma, she visibly takes a breath, recenters herself, and then usually her response is, what can I do? How can I help? What do you need from me? And that does work. And I like that approach. That lends itself to my heart and my psyche better than lashing out. And so, thinking about what works and what doesn't, and how you can use that to build compassion and community with people around you is really helpful. Finding your buddies in crisis or your buddies in trauma, that's a key too, right? You got to know who to go to when you're experiencing trauma. It's not fun to go to somebody and tell them something traumatic and then have them respond with anger. You want to go to my other aunt who responds with, I'm very sad that this happened. What can I do to help? Or how can I be present for you? So that's part of, figuring out who you work with, who you live with, who you're friends with, and then being strategic in your trauma response. When you have a day of trauma, who are you going to go to and why? And what are they going to do to help you through your process? One of the things that they suggested for this, which I thought was really neat, was to think of someone from your early life who showed you compassion. Hold them in your thoughts for a few moments and remember what it felt like to feel that compassion. And as I was preparing for this, I did this activity and it felt like a hug and it was lovely. And that's also something that I think I'm going to try to add to my toolbox of trauma stewardship tools, is remembering what it feels like to be held in compassion and have that for other people, not just for myself, but for others who are going through trauma. They also have this really cool tool or task of generating a list of 5 people or situations where an increase in compassion could change the dynamic. Try approaching that person with increased compassion 1 time a month for 6 months, and then note the difference in your mood and feelings. And this is because this section south it's about building compassion, but it's about building community. And what they talk about a lot in the book is this is where folks who are focused on systemic change may find some tools that are particularly helpful. But we all have somebody in our lives who we could approach with a little bit more compassion. And what the authors posit is that when we take intentional steps to engage with people in the way that will help us respond healthily to trauma or to whatever unpleasant vibe they're giving off, we're actually going to notice an improved sense in our own mood and an improved perception of that other person. So it's going to build our capacity for community building, increase our capacity. It's going to increase our ability to work across the aisle, so to speak, with people that we don't normally agree with, we may not like. But if we can do that. Now they say, do it once a month for 6 months. So they presume this is someone you're going to have regular repeated contact with. It might be, once a day for 5 days because you're at a trial, right? But thinking about that is also a really great tool for building that compassion and community. And then the last thing that they suggest for this one, which I actually really struggled with, was think of it talks about microculture. And I was like, what is this microculture? Because it was just a description of a situation that I had not heard before. I was like, oh, okay, this is my community. These are my people. But it says, think of an area where you're privileged. So where you are part of a dominant group, and identify 4 ways you could be an ally to somebody else. Again, being intentional, use your privilege for good once a week for 2 months. Note the difference in your mood, feelings, etc. And again, this goes back to systemic change, right? And identifying these things. So, and it could be very simple. When I lived in New York, and I went back and forth, but whenever I'd go to New York City, I would pass by a lot of homeless people. And I always tried to smile and make eye contact and say, hi, how are you? There were times where I carried cash with me every time I went, so I could give everybody there something. And so those were different little, and I didn't realize this is what I was doing, but this is what I was doing. I was trying to be an ally, to show compassion to people who were not getting it a whole lot, to help humanize people who were not being humanized on their daily interactions with folks. And I always felt better. I never felt like, oh, I shouldn't have given them that money, or, oh, I can't believe I learned that person's name. I never felt bad about it. I always felt like, hey, maybe I might have been the only person that talked to them today, or that made me feel better because now I know that there's this person named Tim who has a dog and he's a veteran and he lost his house because of his PTSD. Like now I know this person, right? So these are some great things that can help you, especially in that big systemic change, culture change, community change aspect of what we might be doing as helpers. And then West is about finding balance. And this was another one I was like, "Oy, I can only imagine the eye rolls that I'm going to get on this one." Write down all of your sick time, vacation time, etc., and then start planning how you're going to use it. Insert eye roll from all of the helpers who don't have time to take time. um, but again, it's about finding balance, right? And I really do believe as helpers, we don't get paid enough to not take advantage of our benefits, and leave time, vacation time, sick time, paternity time, or parental time. Um, um, what's the bereavement? They're there for a reason. They're there because we need to have them and use them. And so being intentional, being motivated to use these things in a way, and not just use them, but use them in ways that are going to give us joy and are going to help us refill our cup. You know, I oftentimes joke, I want a week staycation so I can like repaint my house and do all the household things. Have I scheduled it? No, but I keep saying it. I'm bringing it into existence by putting it out there on this webinar. Now I have accountability colleagues who can check in with me and be like, "Hey, Samantha, have you painted your house?" So that's, and that's another part of it. Sometimes we do need that accountability to find balance. Part of that is, when we talked about physical care, going to the gym, and we all know that gym buddies help us go to the gym more often. Walking buddies help us engage in walking more often because we're being accountable to somebody. And sometimes that's the push we need until you do it. And yes, even if you do, quote, get paid enough, take the time. You should work just as hard no matter what you're paid. I agree 110%. And I do say that as a joke. But yes, you should take the time, because even if you were paid, Elon Musk, well, maybe that's not a great example. Somebody, Bill Gates wages, because Elon Musk, his wealth has just plummeted. But even if you're paid like Bezos wages, you can't work 24/7, 365. You can't do it. You have to take time for yourself. And you best believe that Bezos takes time for himself. There's some island he and his whoever are jetting off to on a regular basis. They take time to play. We should also take time to play. So yes, thank you for raising that as a good point. Okay. So for the finding balance, the West, one of the other suggestions they have, and I really like this too, is at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, identify one thing you're grateful for. I think a lot of folks do the grateful thing, at least around Thanksgiving. That's when we do it in our family, when we all go around and say something we're thankful for. But I really like the idea of starting the day being like, you know what, I'm grateful for waking up. I'm grateful for a good night's sleep. I'm grateful that I had company yesterday at my outreach. I'm grateful for whatever, and then ending it. And again, it's sort of like bookending your day with positivity, as opposed to getting up and being like, oh, all my bones are creaking because I'm getting old and, I'm tired and all of this stuff. It's again, being intentional with creating these positive ways of navigating the stresses in our life so that we can build our tolerance, we can build our immunity. And then the fifth direction, in case folks were confused, is the center here. And this is about centering ourselves. And there's a couple suggestions here, kind of along the lines of that last section of taking a minute each day and saying, what is my intention for the day? What is my one goal for the day? And it could be to make a phone call. It could be to close a case. It could be to not lash out at somebody at your office who's just being, a giant a-hole or whatever. But again, starting it with some intention each day and a thoughtful approach to how you're going to deal with the stresses of your life. And then I'm a big fan of basically a day of rest. At least 4 or 5 hours. I want at least a half a day where I have no obligations. I don't have to do laundry. I don't have to do chores. I don't have to work. I don't do anything. And if I want to lay on my couch with my mouth agape and play solitaire on my phone, I can do that. It's just a period of the weekend. For me, it's a weekend where I have 4 to 5 hours where nothing is committed. I also, when I lived in New York, I had a routine of kind of switching things up. So like one week I would go and get my nails done. One week I would go and get my hair done. One week I would meet with my therapist, also a big fan of therapy. Everybody should have a therapist. And then one week I would get a massage. And so every week I had 1 hour where I wasn't on my phone. I had no obligations to anybody but myself. And that was a privilege. I was in a very privileged position to be able to do that time wise and resource wise. So I'm not saying that this is going to work for everybody. I do not do this now that I live in Florida. Those are not options for me anymore. But I loved having that hour where I knew someone was going to take care of me and I didn't have to be responsible for anything. And as somebody who's responsible for everything in their job, I'm a department head, so to speak. It was, man, let me tell you what a relief that was and how freeing it was to have that hour where it was like, I can just breathe. That's all I have to be responsible for right now. And that was my centering. Now I don't do that here. I have different practices. My solitaire game has become one of them where I just unwind and do mindless solitaire for like an hour. And that's part of it. Part of it is being on my front porch. I have this lovely porch swing, or gardening. So finding those different things are really important. And of course, the upshot of all this is that when you become stress resistant, when you build up your immune system to stress and trauma, then you have all of these wonderful benefits, right? You start building these strong social supports by identifying people who respond in ways that are helpful for you and productive for you. You engage in lifestyle choices that are healthy for you and productive for you. And of course, the sense of personal control. We all, especially for folks who work with domestic violence survivors or sexual assault survivors, volition is a big part of that will, the power and control wheel, and having a sense of personal control is really important. And when we can step back from feeling like we are being affected by our trauma or controlled by our trauma or stewarded by our trauma, then we can actually start to steward it and we can take that control back. And that's really wonderful way to create that compassion satisfaction and to have the supports that will allow you to engage in the help work that you're doing. Of course, mindfulness is good. It has all of these wonderful benefits. It helps us decrease stress, builds resilience, activates empathy parts of our brain, it reduces fear. These types of practices actually deal with the biochemical components of our system and can help us release the important chemicals that make us happy and less afraid, that can increase empathy and make us feel strong or self-assured, and can reduce the chemicals that make us feel stress and fear and anger and isolation. So there's a lot of different things that can be really helpful in this practice, and I encourage folks to give it a shot. The last thing I want to throw in here is really about organizational support. This is not a vacuum. And again, I wanted to tie back into a little bit of what Emily talked about last week in engaging in trauma-informed care in our work. But as you recall, there's 3 levels of trauma stewardship, and one of them is organizational. So take a look around, what offers are your employers making to help you deal with the trauma of your work? Do they provide mental health services or benefits? Do they offer a variety of tasks or breaks from trauma-related tasks? If you're working with a client who is particularly traumatizing for you, do you have the ability to switch off of them or take a break and do something else for a little period of time, like integrate more outreach, integrate a mentor component where you're working with somebody else on a different issue? Do your supervisors talk to you about this? I'm always encouraging my direct supports to take your leave. If you need a mental health day, take a mental health day and just say, I'm taking a mental health day. Like, I always joke about this. I think especially, I can only say this as a woman, but especially as women, I feel like sometimes we downplay things. And this is how I'm doing it is, I've had really severe menstrual cramps my entire life. And I've always said, I'm taking a sick day. And it wasn't until fairly recently where I'm like, you know what? I'm cramping and I can't work. And I talk about those things a little bit more openly. And I usually do with mental health days, right? I'm feeling sick. I'm gonna take the day. I'm not sick. I need a mental health day. I need a break. And so being, does your place provide you with that kind of support to where you can display that level of honesty and openness with them? So they don't think, oh, well, she's home with the stomach flu, when you're really maybe home in a fetal position crying because of the case that you lost yesterday. There's different responses that are appropriate from your employer, just as like there's different responses that are appropriate from you or your spouse, right? If you're curled up in a fetal position crying, you probably don't have to call an ambulance or take, tummy medicine, right? Whereas if you're puking and have diarrhea because you have a stomach bug, maybe you don't need a box of tissues and talk about your feelings. So there are different responses that are required for these things, and having organizational support is a part of that. And so as we become stewards of our trauma, stewards of our stressors, moving our organizations into that role is also, part of how we can give back to others. So I'm going to end with the last two slides here. I love this quote: "Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, and do that. The world needs more people who come alive." And when I work with students, I always, what are you interested in? Well, I want to do criminal law. I'm like, that's not what I'm interested in. What I mean is, what do you want to spend your time doing? What do you want to get paid to do? What physical skills and actions, what mental skills and tasks do you want to be doing? Because there's a place for you anywhere, but what makes you happy? And that's why I always joke about, I want to get paid to drink coffee and read books, right? That's what makes me come alive. That's what makes me happy. It's getting my brain working and thinking about stuff, and good coffee because it's delicious. And I'm a little flippant in that, but there's an element of truth to it too. And that's what makes me able to do the things that I do, like present, despite a fear of public speaking that has gone back, 2 decades, right? What do I enjoy doing? I love teaching. I love talking to people. I love learning new things. And I read a bunch of books for this, and I learned a lot, which was really exciting. I did want to include a slide that has the resources that I used. These are the 3 primary things that I used in the presentation. There's a ton of resources out there. This is by no means intended to be complete or exhaustive, but this will be available to you. I do really highly recommend Trauma Stewardship. I bring it up a lot in my everyday. I recommend my students read it. I recommend my colleagues read it. I'm a big fan of that approach. And then the last slide in time, if anybody has questions, I would love to hear from folks. If you have any questions or thoughts about what we discussed or what I talked about.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Samantha. Everything I said in introducing you just always, it proves true. You really make this conversation feel open and attainable. And I know for me, I don't know anyone in the virtual audience, I can't speak for anybody else, but, dispel some of my fears of, am I the only one feeling this way? Am I the only one who, so I just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you. My pleasure. And I think it's important. I mean, we all have, I have a colleague in the pro bono sphere, and I made a comment one time about imposter syndrome, just kind of in passing, like, sometimes we all feel this. And she messaged me privately and was like, let me know when you're having that. Like, I'll be your buddy here, and we all have it. None of these emotions are unique. We all experience this to different degrees and different severities. But, kind of like, what's the saying? The greatest trick of the devil is making you believe he doesn't exist, right? That's this, right? The greatest trick of all of these things is making you think you're by yourself, because when you're alone, you're weaker and you can't fight back as well. And you struggle more to find the tools that you need to process it. So I think it's really important. That's why I talk about having a therapist. I think it's great. I've had a therapist since I was in law school 20 years ago, or 15 years ago. And, sometimes it's just a tune up. Sometimes it's just, hey, I did this presentation, I'm exhausted, or, whatever it is. But sometimes it's heavier stuff. And I think it's important for us to talk about it because, it's something like 1 in 7 attorneys suffers from addiction or mental health issues. And these tie in, so directly to that. So.
Absolutely. And, folks, while we're having this conversation, please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat or the Q&A. I know last time we were unable to get off the recording and have more of an open discussion. I was so enthralled listening to Samantha, I forgot to grab the CLE code. So I'm going to grab that code, put it in the chat, and then we can turn off the camera. But before we do that, while we're waiting, I just want to say, even in my personal experience, I think that, something you brought up is that this situation that we feel like if we take a day off, if we don't do it, nobody else can, and everything's going to burn. And I still suffer from that. And it took me a while to realize that that was a trauma response. Um, with that in particular, like, what do? You just actually take your day off and realize the world's not going to crash, right? That's what you
Well,
do.
it's like, people, the sun will come up tomorrow. It does. And when you realize it, are there and again, I'm not saying this is fail proof or 100% of the time. Sometimes there are real consequences, right? We can't just not come to work because we're having a sad day when we have a trial scheduled. That's
Right.
not something you can do, right? But if you have co-counsel, you can shift responsibilities. You can prep them and say, I'm not on my A game, right? It's like Simone Biles. I have the twisties. I can't do this.
Right.
Um, and they still won the championship. Like, you know, the greatest athlete in the world took a day off. Team still came out first. So I think, that's a good reminder. And again, I'm not trying to be flippant with this. Like, the world will continue. And in most of our cases, our clients will not have irreparable harm if we take a day off. Our colleagues will not suffer irreparable harm if we take a day off or a week. It might require planning. It might require some strategizing. But it's not impossible. And we do all too often feel like it is.
I feel like I need a mantra of that every single morning when I wake up, not just in my work life, but also in my personal life.
Yeah.
And so, with that, I do want to let folks know I did pop the CLE code into the chat. It is 2309602, N as in Nancy. Again, 2309602, N as in Nancy. And that is one general CLE credit and one mental health and wellness CLE credit. So if you attended, both of these in this training series, I think you got 2 mental health and wellness and 2 general. So I think that's pretty awesome. So now what I'm going to do is we do have about 2 more minutes left. I am going to stop the recording just in case anybody wants to be more engaged and have any conversation. So folks, you can raise your hand. I can take you off mute if you want to pose a question that way, or just in the chat, or maybe Emily, if you have anything that you want to come in and chime in on, we'll do that with the recording off. So with that being said, I'm going to say goodbye to the recording world and create a little bit more of a personal space.